The technique I'm going to be showing you now will allow you to create extremely highly detailed plants by increasing the geometry amount of the overall plant. More specifically, being able to do that with the leaves. Now, this technique, in previous versions of Vue, it wasn't really possible. In Vue 7, there were a few changes made that are going to allow this to happen. Now, earlier in the training, I showed just kind of how I made this plant stand just using displacement baking. Well, we're going to be doing the same thing for the tree. And what I have, in this case, just a plant instead of a tree. I'm loading in number Tropical 35 from the Tropical Plant Collection, but you'll be able to do this with any plant or any species you have available. I like this plant, so I'm going to stick with it. I've been able to create some really interesting variations from it. Now there are a couple of things you need to keep in mind for the baking, and there are also some really interesting and neat things that kind of come out of this. We'll start just by editing the object, because I do want to make a couple of modifications to try to get the detail of the leaves a little higher. And what I want to do is increase the curl, or actually what would be decreasing it in this case. And when I decrease the curl amount, we're kind of folding the leaves over. But what I'm going to do is now increase the width. And we can see that nice kind of cupped leaf. I'm also going to go into the stems and just remove some of the droop amount. And the flexibility on this species, it doesn't really bend the leaf too much, unfortunately. So there's really only so much can be done with that. Kind of bring it back to where it was before. Take a look at the hooking point. I'll go ahead and bring it in on the stem just a little bit. Click OK. And now what we're going to be doing is working with this plant. Go ahead and take a look at just a quick preview. And this is a really low quality render, so it doesn't look amazing. There are a few steps we have to take before we can perform the operation, and also a few things we need to preserve from the current object. I'm going to go over to the material for the leaf, and we can access this from the plant materials or going up to the aspect tab. Now if we take a look at the bump that I have, I'm using both a noise to generate kind of an overall displacement. This works better for ecosystems when you're farther away, because you normally have to use a much finer bump to get the fine details on a leaf, but from farther away they really don't show up, so then you don't have a bump. So if you blend it together with a noise node, you'll be able to effectively use the same plant for ecosystems from farther away, and then also ecosystems and individual plants much closer to the camera to get the fine details, but also just not have to swap anything out. So I'm just using a combiner for this, where the amplitude of the image map is 0.2 and the amplitude of the noise is 1, which is the typical amount. Now, this operation will essentially destroy the bump, and we also don't want to use this really finely detailed bump map to generate our displacement and create our detail. So what we need to do is find a way to preserve it. Now, unfortunately, just disconnecting it and leaving it in the function, it might still get deleted and removed if it's not connected to anything. So we're going to create kind of just a connection, but make it so it's not active and not really affecting anything. And I'm going to add in a combiner node, set it to blender, and I'm going to take the ratio and bring it all the way to 1. So now we have two inputs on the top, input 0 and 1. And I'm going to select input 1 and use this highlight map that I'm using. And with the blender, it's now redirecting directly to the highlight map. So I can connect input 0 to what we had as the bump, and it's not going to manipulate anything. It's now just connected to the function as sort of a preservation. I'm going to delete the combiner that I have, so I'm just using the noise node. If you want to add in a noise node, you can right click, add in noise, and Perlin noise. I'm using gradient. You really don't want to use value for this. Anything with value in it is going to create a very, very harsh, almost pixelated look, and you really don't want that. The scale, I do have my wavelength set to 1, but since we're doing, or 1.5, but since we're using displacement, I am going to bring it down to 1. Just a very, very simple Perlin noise. Set our scale to 10 for now. Another thing to keep in mind is right now, the mapping mode is object mode, which means this position is based on the object and all the leaves are going to be exactly the same. Well, I want some variation, so what I'm going to do is add input node position options. This is a variation of the position where we can choose the coordinate system, separate from the rest of the material. So I'm going to run this noise in the world standard coordinate system, and that way all of our leaves will end up different. Now we need to boost the depth, and I'm going to go ahead and increase it to 2 and turn on displacement mapping. There's a couple of things to keep in mind with this, and a couple of extra details you can get out of the displacement by using some of these options. I'm going to turn off move ecosystem instances since we're not going to have an ecosystem on this leaf, and select displace outwards only. What this does is restricts view from moving the displacement down underneath where the geometry is. So rather than it having fall below a certain amount, we're just having to have it go up. And this is going to be important for preserving the polygon surface and making sure that not all the leaves are just going through each other. And this next option is force extension. This does very interesting things with leaves. And in this case, it's actually going to create an extra set of leaves that are going to be completely different than what we're working with and looking at rendering right now. But they usually end up more interesting. Either way, even if they're similar, they can still be used to add more leaves in detail. Now the hooking points might not always match up. It might require a little bit of editing. We'll take a look at that in a minute. For this force extension, I'm going to set it to 2. And I'm going to turn off one-sided. We no longer want the leaves to be one-sided. And the quality boost, I'm going to crank all the way up to 4. Now because I'm using just a simple Perlin noise, that quality boost is really going to help us and not going to increase render time that much, if at all, because it's such a simple node. So kind of looking at the preview render, you can start to see that the leaves are being displaced just by that very simple noise. What you'll also notice is we have a doubling of the leaves, which is that extra subset. So there's some very thin leaves followed by the larger leaves, which are the ones we were originally working with. So it has separated the geometry by using the force extension and generated 2 different sets of leaves. Now, we don't really have any direct control over that at the moment, and for the most part, this displacement is fairly basic. I also want to note that I did not leave the image map connected to the displacement because it is an image and you can only get so much detail from it for this displacement to really work correctly and blend best with the noise and the overall displacement. It's really best to not use images. using the techniques I showed earlier, where you really smooth out the maps using reduced noise and also the smooth surface blur. Those really help 16-bit mode, 32-bit modes, grayscale files. You can get a closer image map to being able to use that for displacement, but I typically recommend using these noise nodes, very simple, basic setups. Just enough to get the detail. And we're going to go back and edit this a little further. I do want to change the scale down to, let's say, 8. And I also want to use a turbulence node. So if we go over to the left, we can select the turbulence. And I do want this to be connected to that world coordinate system, so we can change the vector from the input. And what we're going to do is control the origin of this material and distort it with the turbulence. So we could just connect the origin on the side to the turbulence, or you can extract the origin, which will create a constant node connected, and then you can just disconnect and connect it to the turbulence. Without really making any modifications, let's just take a look and see how that is going to turn out. It might be a little too rough, but as you can see, it does generate a very large amount of detail. Now, I can tell that this looks like it's using a value noise. It might just be because it's really small. But if we take a look, it looks like the simple turbulence just kind of has that built in. So we're going to switch to the advanced turbulence. We're using the gradient. I have vortices turned on. And what I want to do is decrease the roughness. We don't want to have it all that rough. Let's type in 0.25. And the amplitude, we'll leave it at 2 for now. Oh, and I did cancel it. So just change that back. And we can preview, and it looks like maybe that's a little too much. So I'm going to take that largest feature, increase it to 10, amplitude to 0.1, just a very small amount of distortion. And you could use a different coordinate system for the turbulence to generate a little more detail. It really depends on what you want to pull out of it. You could also increase the depth amount to really create a lot of variation. And you can see what that's doing to the leaves. It's really curving, but that's not really going to work for this type of plant. That would work great, however, for creating a corn leaf. But you can switch through different noises if you wanted to. I am going to turn down the largest feature back down to 5 since we reduced the amplitude. Take the depth, bring it down to 2. And this is going to modify, like I was saying, the hooking point. So if you need to, towards the stem of the leaf, you can set up a function to reduce the displacement at that point, and or basically remove the displacement, kind of great, using a fade into it. And that way the hooking point will stay the same. But with the force extension and all that happening anyway, it's probably not going to match up perfectly, at least not with the new subset being created. For that, the best node would probably be going through one of the tooth patterns. So under Math, and using a tooth Gaussian. Setting this up to position it correctly might take a little bit of time. But that's really going to work the best. Just kind of position it around the stem. You can set up a blender subtracting from the displacement or overwriting the displacement. But we're just going to stick with these settings for now. And now we can directly bake this object. So rather than baking it first and then running the displacement, in order to really get an accurate, non-textured tearing surface, because what can happen if you bake it first and you don't have enough geometry, or just the way the system is set up, it generally does tear the polygons apart and creates just awful looking structures. So without converting it to polygons before running the displacement, we're now going to bake to polygons. And I do suggest for plants going slightly over the 50% marker. A lot of the time, for a lot of the different operations, different objects in view, the bake function between 60% and 100 is typically 100%. Don't pay attention to the estimated number of vertices or polygons. It's never been correct. Not really sure why, but usually anywhere between 60 and 100 ends up producing just about the exact same surface. Now, it does vary between the type of object you're baking. Baking a simple primitive, this is going to be more accurate, but with plants and rocks and terrains, those ranges tend to spread out a little more and follow a little more along those lines. So this says a little over 500,000 polygons, but right now in the scene there's 309,000, and a lot of those are being created by the plant pedestal, so definitely was not that close. So now we can see the two different subsets and two different sets of leaves that were created. A very thin version that's very twisted, looks really cool, and then the version that's really more like the original plant surface. And in a way, it's almost undistorted if you're looking at it. So in this case, it might actually need to be run again on those leaves. Let's take a look. We can now see there's a duplicate of the Tropical 35 leaf material in the scene, and we now have a baked object. I also want to note that because we are baking this into an object, it is no longer a solid growth plant. It is actual geometry, which means we cannot grow a new species. You can perform this operation on multiple variations if you wanted to create a little set of these high-resolution plants. But it will not work with wind, and it does not work with solid growth. There are some ways to get it to look like it's reacting with the wind. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. But if we take a look at these surfaces now, we're going to have two, both named the same thing. Since we had one leaf material, we now have two. Number 3 is going to be those really thin leaves that we're seeing that are really displaced. And if we open up the material, we're going to see that that bump channel is completely removed, displacement mapping is turned off, and that's why we preserved this bump map. So that all we really need to do is reconnect that to the bump. But first, if we move over into the second material, we can see that displacement mapping is still turned on, which also leads me to believe that that other subset really doesn't have any sort of displacement applied to it, and we'd either have to rerun it on the leaves. Another thing you could do is copy and paste the plant to have that version and the solid growth version still in the scene if you wanted to maybe run it a couple of times, get some different types of leaves. But what I'm going to do is just turn off displacement mapping on this surface. And yeah, we still see that setup there, and it's really has preserved it. So we'll just keep those original leaves, and then our displaced leaves will be separated on a different material. We can delete that blender, connect the highlight to the original highlight map, the bump back to our bump image, and I also want to note that the mapping mode has changed. Instead of using the flat vertical mapping mode, it is now using automatic, and automatically connecting to the UV map that was generated when the plant was baked. All other options remain the same, interpolation types and so on, But the mapping mode with this type of plant, once it's been baked, is now automatic because it is connected to a UV map. Anytime you're using a UV map, you either use the UV input node of UV coordinates, which will automatically, if set to automatic mode, grab that UV set of normals, and with the projected texture map, that mapping mode is automatically built in, so you just set it to automatic. But in this case, it does it for us. I'm going to turn down the bump, 0.2. I might be able to increase it a little higher. Let's go ahead and do 0.35. And now I'm also going to just select this little arrow up in the aspect tab at the preview of the material to switch to the next material, and then we can edit the function. We can either copy and paste the material over or just reset up that function, just reconnecting to the bump. And this time I'll use 0.2, so it's a little different. This set of leaves is the ones that's really distorted, so it might not need as high of a bump map. So I'm going to go ahead and just render this out really quick before making any modifications. Now I rendered this pretty low res, low quality settings for the anti-aliasing, so it doesn't look amazing, but you can see all of that nice little details on these really high geometry leaves. Now the bump map might be a little high, and I also want to note whenever you're using an image to control a bump, the output is a lot different than using the functions, using fractals, using noise nodes. And you almost always have to turn the depth down to 10%. 10% is pretty typical, sometimes even lower, because that effect on the surface from an image is much higher. I normally go between 10 and 20%, sometimes a little higher if the quality of the bump is smooth enough, where there aren't a lot of really rough areas where you're going to see the pixelation caused by the interpolation type. Bilinear is the best, but doesn't always smooth it out completely. We'll go back, and I'm going to do the same, just using 0.1. So it's a much lower amount, but it'll just pull out kind of the finer details. There's another note I want to make, and this is really important. Since we're now dealing with a different kind of object, an actual polygon mesh, when we right-click and edit the object, it's going to pull up the polygon mesh options. With all meshes, smoothing mesh, using a smoothing angle is applied, and is pretty much necessary. Without the smoothing angle, you're going to get a polygon-looking surface that is not smooth, and you're really going to be able to see those polygons standing out. Now this is a pretty high resolution mesh, so looking at it right now with the preview render, it's not completely apparent that that option is turned off. Lower resolution mesh will definitely show up. If we switch to the wireframe mode, we can see that the baked polygon object, the one with the displacement run on it, the newly generated subset, is a very high res. So really the smoothing angle in this case isn't going to show or have a huge drastic effect, but it is required. Otherwise flickering will be much worse. So it is important that we turn this option on, especially for leaves, and if you're going to be decimating the mesh at all. Now, I wouldn't recommend reducing the polygon amount by decimating. It does tend to tear the polygons and create kind of a bad look. Back to the smoothing angle. This would be the equivalent to kind of a Phong shader, available in other applications. And what it does is will smooth the mesh up to the specified angle. So anything lower, it's going to look more like the geometry. And the higher we increase this amount in the angle, the more it's going to smooth everything out. So if we had, let's just say, a flat polygon surface, and we turned the smoothing angle on, it's going to appear almost rounded in a way. If we turn it off, it's going to look completely flat. It's really more about how it smooths between the normals and reacts with specular shading. So in this case, we could set the option at least 90 or at least 89 degrees. Sometimes, if it's really, really distorted, you might have to go a little bit higher to 180, which would be almost a max smoothing angle. But 90 is going to work pretty well, and then it'll smooth the mesh out. I'm going to go ahead and bring this back to the smooth shaded mode. And it does look like I offset my camera a little, so I'm going to go ahead and just reposition it. Now, at the moment, we don't really have a lot of control over these individual leaves, or the different subsets that were created. So what we can do is if we select the object again, going back into those polygon mesh options, any material that is separated will be able to split into separate objects. Now first what I want to do is go into that new material that was created and just change the name to _new, just so there's no material naming conflicts. And go back, edit the object. And now if we select split, it'll break the object up into 3 parts: the trunk, the original leaves, and then the displaced leaves. So if we turn off the original, the ones with really no displacement on them, go up to the top, the aspect tab, we can select hidden, and now just view those displaced leaves. If we check the little icon to put an X over it, or go up to the top with the little ghost icon, we can hide it from the render. And you'll be able to see just those displaced leaves. And so we can see this a little better. Go ahead and render something a little higher quality. And you can really see how interesting those leaves are, all the detail. But once again, of course, they're not going to be connected to the plant because of the way they were generated. So really the best thing you can do, besides going into another application and modifying it by polygons, you can scale it down and try to get it to match up, or using the other surface and the other set of leaves, just kind of mixing them together to add more variation to the plant. And like I was saying before, making sure that you copy and paste the original vegetation file before applying the displacement, then you'd be able to run that process a couple of times to generate more variations to kind of mix with each other. So we're just going to scale them up and just kind of fit it into the plant. And it creates a nice little variation where it will blend in enough. And those new leaves, since they're a little smaller, what we can do is change that overall color, make them a little brighter green. Maybe not that much. When you're changing the overall color, it is very sensitive to the changes made, and even the slightest movement can oversaturate the color. So it is important to pay attention to that. But now we can see the leaves are much brighter, and if we wanted to throw another bit of bump on there mixed with a noise, we could easily do that to add even more depth. And by using the same material or the same setup that we used to displace the material, it would essentially add to the depth of the leaf, and it would be very similar to making a very large smoothing angle. That, of course, would still need to be part of the material. In this case, we deleted it. So if you want to create a couple of copies to work with while you're working on a plant like this, that's always a good idea. Have some object files to fall back to. But this will work correctly with backlight. Just make sure that you have one side turned off, which works differently with these polygon meshes than it does with the plant, which is another reason we were able to create this extra subset, because the plants really seem to be two sets of polygons directly on top of each other. So it still works with backlight all the same way. You just need to make sure that one-sided is turned off, which is normally turned on within the veg files. And also keeping in mind that we're now using the automatic mapping mode rather than flat vertical. Now, if we wanted to create a wind effect, it would be rather difficult on a plant like this. One possibility, so I'm going to go ahead and just select these displaced leaves, copy, and paste. Because keep in mind, now that we have a new object, we can also create duplicates. They are higher polygon meshes, so they will take up more memory within your scene and for the actual file. So now we can have a little more duplicated geometry, a lot more leaves. Very interesting plant. But creating a wind wouldn't really be super realistic on this. The effects you could do are over time you could maybe make some scale changes, a slight rotation. Other than that, besides advanced setups, which would be running another displacement, your best bet on a plant like this would be to create a very large noise node and animate it over time. So if we edit the material, add in the noise, there's an animated option which will connect it to time, and this is going to be very fast. What it's going to do is kind of ease in and out of the surface. Basically it reverses and then goes back over time. And what you would want to do is create a filter and really tone it down to decrease the speed. You can also use the dynamics nodes to adjust these settings a little further. Create something a little larger, and that would give the appearance that it's kind of moving, but that wouldn't be something you would do for a close-up. That would be for farther away, and it'll work better on a more complex plant, maybe a tree rather than a plant. Other than that, like I was saying, you can go into another application and modify the object. So if your goal is to really just get it out of view and use view to generate these complex plants and then have the ability to bring them into another primary application to modify them, edit them, you'd be able to create a much better animated plant with this mesh in another program. Other benefits of this technique are also the ability to, if we edit the object, bake the illumination directly onto the object. So we can do an illumination pass, and then ignore indirect lighting or not need radiosity, ambient occlusion, anything like that, and still use it for ecosystems. There's also a dynamic subdivision, but that's really not going to be all that useful for this species, and not without displacement mapping still on. If you wanted to reapply it, basically what it does, it'll just subdivide the mesh the closer the camera gets to it. The quality boost amount increases that subdivision, so it'll just increase the polygon count as you move closer to the object. But in this case, it's not really needed because we have a fixed geometry that looks good, and we don't need anything higher. Plus, since there's no overall change in the surface, not like we would have with the procedural terrain, because it's basically the same technology, we wouldn't need that for this plant. And this scene I have loaded in is a modified maple tree. We're doing the same process. First, adjusting the leaves to make them more flexible. Sometimes typing in a value higher than the slider amount will help. I think I used a value about 300 to 400 on this. And I was also able to copy and paste the extracted displacement and the split object based on the material. In this way, you can take some of these trees that are lower poly and really increase the quality. And a tree like this would be much easier to fake the animation for with the bump mapping technique, and also directly editing and making slight adjustments and changes to the leaves. What you can do is move the pivot point. If we go to the numerics tab, all the way in the bottom is the pivot. We could move it down a little lower. And if we wanted to just have a slight subtle rotation of the leaves, because this is a fairly massive plant, or has a decent amount of overall leaf variations and objects, it would be very easy to kind of fake an animation just with different subsets. You could also rescale and make alternate displaced objects, like I was saying, saving that species, the original one, reapplying it, or even using another object and just running it to grab some different leaves and kind of combining those together. So we end up with a much more realistic tree, and starting with the veg species to create a static plant can be really useful, since all the image maps will carry over, and you don't need to worry about modifying or creating any UV maps. So it tends to be a really good process to start in Vue to create a static plant rather than going to another application. Refining it is best in another application, but not necessarily required. So these are some really useful and pretty powerful techniques for creating very high-res plans. The extent of which you go with it is really, of course, up to you and how much your system can handle. Using the high-res species might take a little longer to bake the objects, but I do want to note that a lot of the geometry is typically in the roots and the branches, and not so much the leaf materials. Baking it is really the only way to get that much detail out of the leaves. There's an option. We'll just go ahead and take a look. We'll just load in one of these plants, edit the object, and when you use the ×2 option or divide by 2, which doesn't actually divide the number by 2 or multiply it by 2. It just increases or decreases the poly count. But mostly that's just on trunk and branches. It really does not affect leaves. So for the most part, that polygon count isn't needed to be really high unless you have, for instance, a lot of gnarl or length added to the branches where you would need that extra detail along the branches. Since this is more useful for modifying leaf layers, it's really not something you're going to have to use a whole lot, and if anything, you can just decrease the amount till it stops, because there is a set value of how much you can decrease it. And you can see that the poly count on this bark is really, really low. So in this case, I would want to, once again, preserve that original vegetation file and create a higher baked object just for the tree surface, or the branches and roots, things like that. And then you can kind of piece it together. I also want to note that if we go to the wind options, in this case I do have the breeze and wind turned on, and that can sometimes have an effect on the displacement. And the wind on per plant option will also modify leaf shapes sometimes, so that is just one thing to kind of pay attention to, is whether or not you have that wind option on or off.